This is just a natural condition that all of us suffer from in lots of ways. You just see it with referees because we have a ton of data to measure.
This is TSN In Depth. I'm Rick Westhead, joined by Dean Warren, who refereed more than 500 games in the National Hockey League over 8 seasons, and Toby Moskowitz, who wrote Scorecasting, a book that is sort of the freakonomics of sports. And Toby, let's start with you. What did your research show you about how officials in professional sports are influenced by crowds?
So we looked at the home field advantage as one aspect of in our book, and found that officials, they're human like the rest of us, and they're subject to social pressure. This isn't a conscious bias, but we find that when the call is very close and they're legitimately not sure whether they should call it one way or the other, it's ambiguous. When 20,000 fans scream it should go one way and not the other, it tends to influence your perception. And this is just a natural condition that all of us suffer from in lots of ways. You just see it with referees because we have a ton of data to measure it.
And as we now move closer to the return of pro sports, of course, we're talking about having games without any fans in attendance. So how might this impact the way games are called?
Well, there was an interesting, experiment that was run about more than a decade ago in the Italian Serie A soccer league, where fans were banned from matches because of soccer riots for about 21 matches. And a couple of economists gathered the data and showed that the home field advantage dropped by 80% in those games. And also, they gathered all the referee calls in those games and found that they were much more even across the home and away team, which isn't surprising. If there's no home field advantage, you figure that the calls are going to balance out that way. Interestingly, the same thing has happened recently in the German Bundesliga, where you've seen the same thing, and they've been playing without fans for about a month.
Dean, what do you think when you hear that?
But I think historically, in my respect with other officials, is I never saw, and I don't think a lot of the guys ever felt that they were biased by the crowd. A lot of the guys, obviously, the same as the players, they grew up in officiating from small towns and smaller kids to adults in professional arenas. So I didn't see that. I don't think a lot of the other officials, and speaking to a lot of other officials, they would feel that the hometown advantage wouldn't be prevalent to them.
Dean, what's it like skating in front of 18,000 people? Making a controversial close call in the final minutes of a game, can you hear the insults?
I mean, that's something you would expect if you call a penalty against a home team late in the game, and the crowd's not going to be happy. But it's more important for the guys to do the right thing.
Toby, what did your research show you about the National Hockey League in particular, and how it compares in terms of home field bias by referees to other sports?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to follow up on something Dean just said, which I think is totally right, which is I think these officials are professional. They're not influenced by the booing necessarily. What we found in our research is much more on what's called social influence in psychology, which is you are affected, your perception changes. So what we find is that on the very close calls, your perception of what the right call to make is, where you really don't know what the right call is influenced by that. So I completely agree. I think officials are not trying to cater to the home crowd. I think they're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to be completely unbiased. The problem is that often we don't know what the right answer is, and we're influenced by what others' opinions are. And when you have 20,000 fans' opinions screaming at you, it tends to influence that. Now, coming to hockey, what we find is hockey has one of the lower home ice advantages of all sports, the highest being basketball and soccer, the absolute lowest being baseball. Hockey and the American Football League are kind of in between, in sort of the mid 50%. So it's not a huge influence there anyway.
We know that the companies in Las Vegas that set betting lines take into account all kinds of things, including home ice advantage. So how might those betting lines change in the absence of fans?
Well, I think that's a great question. In fact, if you look at the betting lines historically, they absolutely, nail the home court advantage. The betting markets are pretty efficient, and they get this right. It'd be very interesting to see, and I haven't looked yet, so I think it's an excellent question, as to whether the betting lines in the early sports, let's say in the Bundesliga, for instance, that's experimented with this already, whether those have already adjusted for this home field advantage. It'd be really interesting to see if we come back to the NHL in another month or two, whether that happens, whether or not things will adjust. I suspect they will. I suspect betting markets will adjust very quickly, but it'd be really interesting to see that data.
And just recap for us again, why do officials favor home teams in your research?
If you look at your average call, the referees get it right. They're professionals. They're the best at their jobs. They're trying to do the right thing. It's when you look at the ambiguous calls. So the example I always like to give is in baseball, you have a pitch on the outside corner at 95 miles an hour with all kinds of spin and junk on it, and it just gleams the corner. You could have called that a ball or a strike. It's a 50-50 call. When 20,000 fans or 40,000 fans in baseball are screaming it should be a strike, it tends to influence your perception. Not that you're trying to cater to them, but that you really start to think, well, gee, they're sure it was a strike. I'm not so sure. It looks like a 50-50 call. And you have to make this judgment in a split second. This is a subconscious. If they had, a minute to digest what happens, and you see this sometimes when referees confer, they tend to get it right. They ignore all those other outside influences. And that's why instant replay is there too. It allows them the time on the critical calls to make the call right, to take their time. And then you don't see any biased calls when you see that.
Dean, if you were still refereeing in the National Hockey League, what would some of the concerns be that you have about going back to work? Assuming that we don't know all the facts yet about how it's going to work, at least we know some of them.
Well, health and safety is always a big issue, and I think that would be one of the things the officials would be looking for. Another thing I think they'd be looking for is over an extended period of time in which the National Hockey League is talking about having the playoffs, are these officials going to have to be sequestered and away from their families? And if so, if they do get a chance to break away, if they come back, is there going to be a quarantine period? So I think health and safety is probably the biggest issue. And, obviously officials are used to being away from their families for periods of time when they officiate on the road. But this may be an unusual extended period of time.
Toby, you must have had a few different hypotheses going into your research for your book. What were some of the things that surprised you as you reported it?
So, a number of things surprised me. I mean, this is why you do research. Start with the home field advantage. My initial thought was things like travel fatigue, the fans pumping up the players, all kinds of other things really influence the home field advantage. And I think those things matter to a certain extent, but they seem to have a much smaller effect than I had thought when I set out to look at this. Although we came down on the side of referees making difficult calls in ambiguous situations, siding with the home team as a primary driver, there were lots of other things that didn't pan out that I was surprised by. But probably the most surprising thing was the one that this is the one thing that I get grilled on every time, which is we just don't find much evidence of a hot hand in sports. Even though every player, every coach, I used to play tennis and basketball growing up in Indiana. I always subscribed to it, but the data just really doesn't support it.
Dean, how do you think that NHL hockey is going to look and feel different without any fans in the arenas?
There will be definitely a different feel. And I mean, that may be a good example to see who, some players that may excel in an empty arena and where others don't. And that might just be, a sign of a different thing to look in a player that, that player has the grit that's going to work through in an empty arena.